Masters of Death is one that I would say is like I say, the first things you write, the first things you make, it's kind of a tracing of something else you've seen. So Masters of Death to me felt a little bit derivative. You know, it comes from my real love of Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett um and I like Lemony Snicket, this sort of like buoyancy to the writing. But also this desire. I think it's my most fan fiction-y piece of work. It has fan fiction like tropes in it. The found family feeling, the different romances, the little quest that they go on. Like it has sort of a fan fiction feel to it. It really bridges those worlds for me of like, this is my first original work after doing a lot of fan fiction. And, you know, coming from this sort of internal, very long personal canon, but also kind of discovering what my voice sounded like when I was writing my own characters. And, you know, the end result is something I'm so like, I didn't expect the book to do that well. It wasn't a priority title. Using publishing terms, it wasn't a priority title. It was never meant to be a bestseller. So the fact that it was is like, that just means that I said something that resonated with a lot of people. And that means so much more to me because I said it from a place of play. I said it from a place of not really understanding the industry and not knowing if I could make it as a writer, not knowing that I would spend the next 5 years like trying my best and thinking I was failing. It came from that version of me that was just like, I'm doing this because I love it, because I have something to say. So yeah, it's my most encouraging story. That like if Masters of Death could do well, that book that you have, it'll do well. It'll speak to someone. Well, I actually come from fandom, which is something I like to talk about because that means I'm very character first. Because fan fiction is basically like, the soul of fan fiction is the character. The one sin is getting the character wrong. And so I don't start writing until I have a very clear sense for the character's voice in my head, that I really understand who they are and what kind of world they occupy. And not necessarily details. I wouldn't say that I'm the most like world building detail kind of person. I think there are lots of authors who I see as very methodical, who have like tons and tons of notes and spreadsheets and whatever about their worlds. That's not me. I just know how the character feels moving through the world, what they want, what they really don't want. And with the Atlas series specifically, at the point that I self-published the Atlas 6, I had this idea. I knew I wanted it to be a trilogy. I knew I wanted to I basically wanted to do, just experimenting with form, a really extended character study that would follow 3 books. So to me, like one of my favorite books is the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante. And so I saw myself doing something like that, where it was one long story told in 3 parts. And I knew that I wanted to zoom out. Like I really wanted to play with scope and scale. And so one of my inspirations in terms of form was Westworld, where you would start, you know, in season 1, you're only in Westworld and you kind of are aware that what's happening is wrong, but not in the way that you are once you've like extended beyond and seen how the rest of the world works. And that all of that is sort of purposefully hidden from you until you're zoomed all the way out. So I knew it was going to be book 1 is going to be like a bottle episode, kind of, you know, that it's almost, T.L. Hoochu called it like almost a country house murder book. And I think, you know, that wasn't necessarily in my head when I was writing it, but that's the effect that it has, that it's this almost like the place of the house is very important, that they're all like trapped in this house. And then in book 2, that you would get like a little bit of the outside world. We time travel a little bit. So we see the world, but only in understanding the effects from the character who came from the future. And then we, in the 3rd book, finally see the whole world, and it's supposed to recontextualize this ethical exercise. It was character first. What happened was I had written a book that involved 4 of the 6 characters. So it had so in this first version that I wrote, it was a completely different book. Like it was a portal fantasy. It was like they stepped through doors, and it was a boarding school book. It was a very like, you know, good versus evil. I always say to beginning writers that the first thing you write is a little bit derivative, because the only thing you know how to do is copy what you've seen before, which is like exactly how it's done. My husband is a high school teacher, and one of his students just asked me for writing advice, and she sent me a story, and I was like, I read it and I was like, this isn't what I was expecting. And my husband was like, she's been reading a lot of Dostoevsky right now. And I was like, oh, I see. was like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. That just when you start writing, you're sort of copying. And so what I was doing felt very The Magicians, it felt Narnia, it felt Harry Potter. And I was just like, but this is not what interests me. As soon as I finished the first book, I was like, this is too simplistic. I'm not interested in the four main characters the way they're currently set out. So the four main characters were Libby, Nico, Ezra, and Tristan. And Callum and Parisa were background characters. And that was crazy just because every time they were in a scene, it was like all eyes on them. And so I like messed things around. I was like, okay, we're going to age them up. We're going to give them stakes. I remember that I came up with the, six will enter, only five will leave concept on a road trip. And I was in a McDonald's bathroom and I was like, oh, that's what it's going to be. And then I didn't know that I had something until I came up with Raina, because I was like, what if there was a character who could hear nature speaking to her, but she just hated it? Like, it didn't feel like power to her. It felt like exploitation. And the books in as a whole are really kind of a study on, is there such a thing as power without exploitation? And so I kind of wanted this balance of like the absurd, that she just can't stand this like constant like leeching off her, but in a sort of a pet peeve kind of way, that every time it's just this silly little plant voice. And so once I had like Raina's, I call them like shades on a color wheel. Once I knew what Raina's like weight was, I was like, now I have all six. And at the time I was also I was very interested in the way that hexagons fit into theoretical math. I sort of fell down a rabbit hole with hexagons in nature, something that really factors into my book, Alone with You in the Ether. I really just write about whatever is interesting to me at the time. And I knew I wanted to use quantum theory. I was like, I'm going to make science real and call it magic. And so I wanted this concept of these six characters who almost, to their detriment, are much, much stronger together. They do all their big magic, all their exciting things are only done when all six of them are in the room. And I think that's also built into the ritual of losing one, is meant to it's meant to topple this very steady structure. It's meant to feel like something has been lost in a really significant way. That sacrifice, I think in fantasy, there's always the element of like, magic has a cost, magic is sacrifice, and there's an element of worthiness, I think. So these were all things that I kept in mind, sort of bigger experiments. But when I actually sat down to write, I was just like, these are the characters. These are how they feel about the world going in. And I'm definitely a pantser. I think the Atlas Six is probably my most organized work. Like the Atlas Six, the first book, is probably the most like punctuated, and probably tightest, purposefully so, because I wanted book two to feel a little bit unmoored. I really wanted to play with the sense of, like, for me, dark academia was not a thing when I started writing. Like it wasn't something you could point to. Obviously, The Secret History existed, and I was modeling the psychological thriller aspect off the structure of The Secret History. And I wanted that feeling of when you're in the classroom and you feel really inspired, like you can feel your brain start to change. And that's something I wanted to commit to the page. And then I wanted book two to feel like it does when you're in upper academia and you're like kind of getting the sillies, like you've just been on your own for too long and you've lost track of what's important in life. And like this complete lack of context, purposefully wanted to play with. Writing the Atlas Complex was certainly, I think the melancholy is a good word. Catharsis is like the flip side of that, I think. Melancholy to me is like a very like full sadness, and catharsis is like an empty relief. But yeah, because when I finished the first draft of the Atlas Complex, I thought, this is a really good book, but is it a good end to the trilogy? Like is this a satisfying ending to what we've built up? And so I did have to work it a few times to make it feel, just initially, like the way that I originally wanted it to happen, I knew, for example, I had been hinting throughout the series at the possibility of many worlds and parallel universes, but this was never going to be an across the Spider-Verse, like this wasn't a situation where we were going to multiverse hop. The reason that I wanted to bring in the reason that I wanted to legitimize the idea of the multiverse is to strengthen the argument of like what does it mean to live well? You know, if all outcomes are true, if all outcomes are real, then what makes the right choice? And this is something like I played with a lot structurally in the book. I always knew that there was going to be a part of the Atlas complex that sort of skimmed the multiverse, that we would get this sense that like now in a new way, even though it was true before that the multi-world the many worlds theory like was a real thing, and we were definitely hinting at that being something that they could use. What's important is that in a universe where they're all plausible outcomes are real and equally like meaningful, then it's supposed to recontextualize, what does choice mean? What does it mean to live well? It's really, this is a very existentialist trilogy, which I think is why some people are, they thought they were coming in for like, you know, a little murder party, which they were. I invited them in and in a sort of a sneaky way, and I'm sorry about that. But but it was always me trying to wrestle with what does it mean to exist when we're being told the world is ending? When we're being told that, like, on the one hand, every single choice we make is significant and it's like world ending, but also we feel completely powerful. And so, what does it mean to live well when it's impossible to live ethically? And so, in order to do that, I needed to make all outcomes real. But so because I knew that we weren't going to have like adventures in the multiverse. Um, I initially had them doing the experiment in the first 30% or something. And then it ends at, I think in the actual book, it ends up being around the 50 or 60% mark. So like a lot got built into the beginning. My editor was like, are we sure we don't want to let, you know, and so it's that first part is what got a lot of the editing to make it land better. If you want to read the Atlas series as like, you know, like a fun, like escapist read, you can. And then there's sort of this underlayer that if you really want to think about ethics, you can also do that, and think about, you know, which character is really in the right, and what does it mean to be a hero, whatever. Those thought exercises are available. And so one thing that I think people don't necessarily realize is that the society and the archives of the library are not the same thing. So there's Atlas Blakely's agenda, there's the Alexandrian Society's agenda, and there's the archives agenda. And you don't necessarily understand that those are three separate things unless you're trying to understand that those are three separate things, because Atlas Blakely has a very personal motive. The society is an institution, so it has the same motive that all institutions have, which is their own profit. And then there's the question of what is the motivation of the archives or the library itself. And that is something that that's like the most open-ended. Because when I originally built the library and the way the archives worked, I knew I wanted there to be some sort of question of how sentient they were and how purposeful, like, are they really making choices when they determine who can read what and who can see what? And like, it's almost guiding. It does seem to take on a personality. And Parisa in the Atlas Paradox is the first to recognize that, oh, the archives are like, something here has a vested interest in understanding us. I'm not really an emotional person, but I did tear up a few times every time I was editing, and it was always Parisa's passages. There was something about Parisa, I think, because her story is like, in book one, I say that Parisa is a villain and Libby is a hero. And I said that on purpose because it was being interpreted by an empath who isn't always correct. And that's a very good, actually, Callum is a very good example of a character who states things objectively, like as if they are objectively true, but they aren't, and they can't be, because he's viewing them through something that is never stagnant, emotions that are always dynamic. And so he can never really see the objective truth. And I loved the idea of Parisa being someone who she's so averse to intimacy, so unwilling to sacrifice herself, to kind of make the choice that no, life is important, and it doesn't have to be earned, and I don't have to do anything to be worthy of it. I already am. And to make these choices based on love, and to accept that those things hurt and that people lie and that it's still worth doing anyway. Like, that's the kind of catharsis that I knew was going to happen in this book, that like if we look at my original question of what does it mean to live well, Parisa is kind of my most direct answer to that. Parisa and Reina, arguably, kind of two sides of the same coin. And they end up together for that reason. It's just like these are two people who bring out the best in each other. These are two people who, like, almost against all odds, make each other better